Your first chapter is the make or break of your book. This is the place where you roll out the red carpet and say to the reader, welcome. I promise that what's inside is worth your time. Your first chapter tells them, this is the voice you'll be hearing, these are the stakes, this is the mood, and yes, this is worth continuing. If you break those promises later by suddenly switching tone or not delivering on your setup, you're betraying your readers. Readers browsing in bookstores or online typically read the first page or previews before deciding to buy a book. That's a lot of pressure on those first paragraphs. That's a lot of pressure on the first sentence. So here's what your chapter must do. Hook your reader with something intriguing, introduce your protagonist in a way that makes us care, establish your writing voice, set expectations for your story's tone and genre, and plant the seeds for your main conflict. In today's video, which is the third and final part of this trilogy on how to start writing a novel, I'll be going over all of those things, including plot structures, opening techniques, and common tropes you might want to avoid using in your first chapter. This is gonna be a long one, so grab some tea, a blanket, and let's get started. The hook is your reader's first impression of your story. It's the first line or paragraph that they read when they open your book, and it plays a critical role in your reader continuing or putting it down. Think about the last 5 books you picked up. What made you continue reading past the first page? Probably a killer hook. A strong hook does 3 things. It raises questions, creates intrigue, and compels the reader to continue. The best hooks hint at conflict without explaining everything right away, but the ultimate goal is to disrupt your reader from the hubbub of their everyday thoughts and to think, this is interesting. Here are some effective hook strategies that you can try. You can start with a provocative statement. The day I died wasn't nearly as bad as the day I was born. This immediately raises questions. How can someone be narrating if they died? Why was their birth worse? You can also begin with unusual or specific action that evokes the senses. Lisa paused at the drop of red on the edge of the letter opener. Carefully, she wiped it clean and returned it to her grandmother's velvet-lined box. It's not just Lisa cleaned a knife. It's specific, sensory, and raises immediate questions like, who just died? What you should avoid, though, is starting with mundane activities unless there's something strange about them. For example, Jamie woke up and stretched. It's boring. Jamie woke up in a coffin and stretched is a little bit better. Your hook doesn't need to be the very first line, though that would be ideal, but it should definitely appear in the first paragraph. You need to give readers a reason to keep turning pages from the moment they start your book. The protagonist. After hooking your reader, you need to introduce a protagonist that's worth following for hundreds of pages. Now, I said worth following, but that doesn't mean they need to be likable. Readers don't need to love your protagonist, but they need to be interested in them. There needs to be something compelling about this person that makes readers want to witness their journey, especially if your main character is actually the bad guy. So how do you make readers care about your protagonist ASAP? First, show them wanting something. Everybody has desires, so introducing this will help establish an immediate connection. Maybe it's something simple like peace and quiet, or something more complex like redemption. If you remember in the last video, we talked about our scholar who gets eaten by a 5-headed dragon with a missing head and becomes the 5th head. Her desire is to find her long-lost twin sister. She craves family, and that's something anybody can relate to. Second, put them in a situation that demonstrates their personality. Are they calm under pressure? Do they make jokes when nervous? Do they approach problems analytically or emotionally? These reactions reveal character better than pages of narration ever could. Third, and this is important, give them agency. Sure, there will be events beyond their control that all they can do is react to them, but in all other moments, show them making choices rather than just having things happen to them. Like how our scholar chose to face a dragon instead of enter the ketchup dimension. That's agency, a character making a choice that drives the plot forward, even if it's not the wisest choice. And finally, hint at their flaws or wounds. Like I said in the last video, perfect characters are boring and flat and lifeless and unrealistic. Show us the cracks in their armor, their stubbornness, their fear, prejudice, their traumas. These vulnerabilities create depth and give your characters room to grow. Now the key here is balance. Introduce your protagonist quickly, but don't dump their entire backstory in the first chapter. Allow your readers to uncover that gradually, starting with the most compelling aspects of your character. Your writing voice is something that's unique to you and sets the tone for the entire reading experience. Your voice here encompasses your word choice, sentence structure, pacing, perspective, and even the details that you choose to highlight in the narration. It's how the readers hear your story inside their heads, and in chapter 1, you're establishing the voice that they'll be hearing for the rest of the book. If you're writing in the first-person perspective, your voice becomes even more crucial because it directly reflects your protagonist's personality. A snarky teenager will narrate differently than a 60-year-old professor. Their vocabularies, observations, and metaphors should feel authentic to who they are. For third-person narratives, your voice might be more separate from your characters, but it still needs to match the story's tone. A fairy tale retelling might use more lyrical, flowery language, but a military thriller will use more direct, shorter sentences. Now, one of the biggest mistakes new writers make is trying to sound overly literary or sophisticated by using unnecessary complex vocabulary or convoluted sentences. Unless that fits your story and characters, your goal should be clarity and authenticity. If your target audience doesn't like narrative styles like Wuthering Heights, your book shouldn't use it. Find your natural voice by asking yourself, if I were telling the story out loud to my ideal reader, how would I say it? What words would I choose? What details would I emphasize? Voice isn't just beautiful prose. It's about words that convey your story and its meanings as clearly and concisely as possible. We don't want there to be any buffers or barriers between the text that they're reading and the images that are playing out in their head. For example, if we choose to write our scholar story in a first-person narrative, the scholar would likely have an academic, analytical narrative voice that becomes more frantic and emotional as she's being pursued by the dragon. But whatever voice you establish in chapter 1 has to be consistent throughout the rest of your story. If you start formal and suddenly shift to casual, this will be very disorienting. Your voice is your promise to readers about how you'll tell your story. Make it count from page 1. Now, the first chapter is when your readers will set expectations about the story they're about to read. This doesn't mean giving away the plot, but it does mean establishing your genre, tone, and the general terrain of your story's world. If your book is a romantic comedy, your first chapter should incorporate elements of both romance and humor. If it's a dark fantasy, show us the magic system and hint at that darkness. Now, remember that your readers are smart. You don't need to over-explain things or dumb things down for them. The way you describe settings, introduce conflicts, and present characters all signal to what kind of story you're telling without being obvious about it. This doesn't mean though that you can't subvert those expectations. Many great books do, but subversion works best when you understand the expectations before breaking them. You need to have something established in order for the subversion to have the most impact. Now, setting expectations also mean establishing the scope of your story. Is this an intimate character study or is it a sweeping epic? Is it a standalone book or the first in a series? While you don't need to explicitly state this, the breadth of your world building and the nature of your conflicts should give readers some clues about what they're in for. And finally, your first chapter needs to sow the seeds for the main conflict. This doesn't mean revealing your entire plot, but readers should sense that there are storm clouds gathering ahead. Conflict is the engine of your story. Without it, you just have people doing things. There are multiple layers of conflict that you can introduce in the first chapter. And however many layers you choose to include in this first chapter is completely up to you, your story, the depth of your plot, and how long the book is going to actually be. External conflict. These are visible obstacles that your protagonist faces. The dragon hunting our scholar, for example. Internal conflicts, which would be defined by your main character's personal struggles. So for example, our scholar's phobia of ketchup that affects her choices. And interpersonal conflict. These are tensions between characters. Maybe our scholar blames her twin for their separation, and this complicates the rescue mission. Whichever types of conflicts you want to introduce, you want to do so naturally. As best as you can, avoid info dumping. You don't want to just explain everything in massive chunks of text, especially in the first chapter. That's going to turn them off immediately, unless they're into it. What you want to do is show the conflict through action, dialogue, or a particular situation and let the readers witness the problem rather than being told about it. For your antagonist, you don't need to reveal them fully in chapter 1. Actually, there's power in that kind of mystery, but readers should get a sense of what forces oppose your protagonist. For longer works, especially series, your first chapter might focus on an immediate conflict while hinting at a larger struggle to come. By the end of chapter 1, your readers should have a sense of what the stakes are. Now, these stakes don't have to be apocalyptic, and if they are, the reader doesn't need to know that right from the beginning. The stakes that you introduce at the beginning just need to matter deeply to your main character. And this will help string your reader along for the rest of the ride as you uncover the larger stakes. So now that we've talked about what you should incorporate in your first chapter and why they're important, let's talk about how this first chapter feeds into the overall plot structure of your novel. The most common way to graph a standard story is like a mountain, and your characters are making the journey to climb it. The way you structure your plot determines the kind of climb that they make, and that structure is established through story beats. Story beats mark significant events that happen in your book and serve specific purposes. For example, your exposition point is where you establish your setting and introduce key characters. Your rising action marks the start of a series of events and conflicts that build tension leading up to the climax. The climax is reaching the summit of your story mountain and is the highest point point of conflict and drama. Your falling action happens after the climax and marks the point where your characters start their descent down the mountain. It shows the impact of the climax and moves towards the resolution point. The resolution is essentially the end of your book where your characters have reached the bottom of the mountain, but everything has changed or is different, and they're not the same people who started the journey, and there's a feeling of new beginnings in the air, or dread, depending on what story you're writing. Your first chapter is what sets up this journey. It needs to hook readers in while laying the groundwork for the climb ahead. You want your readers to think, yeah, I'll climb this 20,000 foot mountain with you and then go all the way back down. Now, the mountain is a very standard and basic plot structure, so many great novels actually forego this for different structures, like The Staircase, where there are multiple instances of climaxes and rising and falling actions, or even flipping the mountain upside down if you're writing a thriller. Or you can pull a Margaret Atwood and write a story that braids two parallel timelines together into a story that mimics the same genetic DNA that the characters themselves were playing God with. I love Dorks and Crick, but no one talks about it. The point is, do your research and choose a structure that serves your story. Once you do, it'll be a lot easier to identify how you want to write the opening scene of your first chapter. So 3 ways you can open your story. The inciting incident opening throws your reader right into the moment that disrupts your protagonist's normal life. You're barreling headfirst into the action with no setup to ease them in beforehand. Thrillers, mysteries, horror, and stories where the main conflict needs to be established quickly typically use this type of opening. If we take our scholar story, for example, and we want to immediately establish the kind of danger she's in, we could start at the moment that she finds a clue to her sister's whereabouts, right as she sees the shadows of the dragon looming on the walls. The character-focused opening prioritizes voice and personality over action and lets the readers connect with the protagonist before the conflict starts. Books that would likely use this type of opening would be literary fiction, coming-of-age stories, and stories where the protagonist's internal conflicts, flaws, or their unique voice needs to be understood first. But there's a fine line here that you don't want to cross, which I'll talk about later. So for our scholar story, we could start by emphasizing how much she hates ketchup, and maybe even why, so that when she chooses to face the dragon instead of the ketchup dimension, it makes more sense. The world building opening establishes your story setting first, but still connects to your protagonist and plot. So sci-fi and fantasy stories where the setting is as important as the characters or directly impacts their choices, and stories where understanding the world is crucial to following the plot, these would all benefit from this type of opening. Our scholar story could open this way because the lost twin is in one of the portals within this tower. But because the scholar makes a questionable decision that causes her to be subsumed by this dragon, I think an inciting incident or character-focused opening would work better in this case. But if your story opens in an apocalyptic setting like my current work in progress, you might want to do a world building opening instead. So we've gone through 3 possible opening types to choose from and 2 that would work best for our scholar story. The question then becomes, do we want a character opening where the reader understands why the scholar makes this decision? Or do we want an inciting opening incident where we keep them in the dark and instead hand them a platter full of questions that they need to keep reading in order to find out? These are the kinds of questions you should ask yourself when crafting your opening scene. Yes, it's more work than you might want, but your opening scene is the catalyst from which everything else spawns. If your opening scene isn't interesting, only committed readers will be willing to barrel through it. That's why it's so important not to take the easy route. The easy route being common tropes and cliches that writers typically fall back on when they struggle with their opening. The easy route includes starting too early in the story. You don't want your opening scene to be about your protagonist waking up in the morning and going downstairs to eat cereal, not if it doesn't serve a narrative purpose. Unless they look down at their bowl and there's an eye blinking back at them, your reader likely won't care. Opening with a dream. Dreams are great opportunities for mystery, foreshadowing, or backstory, but not in your opening scene. You're basically clickbaiting them with a good time and then pulling them back into the office early. There is a place for dreams in books, but not right at the beginning. Now you might disagree with me, but hold on, I'm going to explain some exceptions after listing them out, and you'll decide if you fall into those exceptions. Another easy route would be too much backstory. How would you feel if you bumped into a stranger and instead of saying hello, they word vomited all of their deepest fears and traumas and shameful secrets all over you? Could be a meaningful start to a great friendship, could mean they have a few screws loose, but a reader is not going to care about someone's life story unless they have a reason to. If you decide to do a character-focused opening, there is a fine line that if you cross can become too much backstory. You want to write only the details the reader needs to know immediately and incorporate the rest in subsequent scenes or chapters. And lastly, description overload. This is another fine line that you don't want to cross that divides a great world-building opening from a paragraph that has too many adjectives. If you choose to describe your setting in the opening scene, you want to deliver as much visual and sensory impact as possible without sounding like you're trying too hard. In my opinion, the best way to deliver a description is through natural actions and dialogue. But unless necessary, please keep chunks of description to a minimum. 1 chunk, max. Ideally 1 to 2 sentences. Now there's an important note I want to make about these common opening tropes. They're seen as cliches that weaken your opening scene because many writers use them as easy ways to just get the story started and hope that the reader will bear through it. Writers take the easy route because their story needs an opening that's more challenging or difficult than they're willing to take on. And so they opt for an easy opener to move things along, and these 4 tropes are typical openers that they fall back on. That doesn't mean though that they're bad. Good writing can incorporate common tropes without making it read like cliches. It takes those elements and turns them upside down, and it works because it works for that particular story. So if you believe that your first chapter should open with a dream because your story is about dreams, go for it. It just has to work for your story, and it has to make sense with your plot. You don't want to bamboozle your reader by letting them think they're reading about a ketchup-hating scholar who's now part dragon, and then the scholar wakes up and the rest of the book is about them struggling with a math test. And I know that's what book descriptions are for, and you should always read the blurb before buying a book. But let's say you read the blurb, and the blurb is about math, and you're interested in buying the book for the math. And then you open the book to preview the pages, and it starts off about a multi-dimensional tower and a half scholar, half dragon. You're gonna think, hey, this isn't about math. I'm gonna go find a different book. So you now have a solid foundation for starting a novel. To recap the key writing tips we've covered in this trilogy: 1. Daydream to collect your ideas and dump out your brain through focused stream of conscious journaling. 2. Figure out your story's core concept and target audience before you start writing or outlining. 3. Determine what makes your character worth reading, figure out the frameworks that your world operates within, and why they add stakes and challenges throughout your story. And 4. Create a first chapter that makes the book worth reading to the end. You know, a lot of writers opt to skip the first chapter until they've written the whole thing and then return to it once they have a holistic understanding. I personally like to write linearly, and it bothers me to skip a chapter, but I know that once I finish a story, that first chapter will be one of the first things that I rewrite, especially the opening scene. So if you're struggling to write your first chapter because you feel like it needs to be perfect, 1. Remember the tips I mentioned as part 1 of this trilogy, and 2. Just skip it, or don't put any pressure on it for the first draft. The first draft is meant to exist as a hot steaming pile of garbage. Your subsequent drafts are where you refine and polish it into the beautiful diamond that it is. So now that you know what to do, here are your next steps. 1. Figure out your core story concept or high concept pitch. 2. Have one-on-one time with your protagonist and figure out who they really are. 3. Plan your opening scene. And 4. Start writing, whether it's your first chapter or the ending. None of these tips matter if you don't actually write the thing. If you found these videos helpful and are interested in the other writing resources and workbooks that I have, such as my cheap printable 90-day novel launchpad planner that I made just for writers like you, I'll link it in the description, and it'll take you to my Etsy shop where you can browse my other cheap writing workbooks. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more creative writing tips and tutorials, and drop a comment sharing the first line of your opening scene. Every published author started where you are right now, staring at a blank page. But now you have a roadmap to follow. Thanks for watching. Until the next chapter.